I have written 3 versions of this report. The first version I submitted to Director Orvith Saul on the morning after the initial deployment. It was 11 pages. It said the operation had encountered an anomaly and requested an additional 6-cycle observation window before reclassification. Director Saul approved the extension without reading past the 3rd paragraph. The second version I submitted 40 days after that. It was 4 pages. It said the Korath pack had failed to complete their clearance function, that the anomaly was persistent and possibly behavioral in origin, and that I was recommending a full operational review before escalation. Director Saul forwarded it to the Collective's Threat Assessment Bureau without responding to me directly. I took that as an answer. This is the 3rd version. It is not a request. It is not a recommendation. It is a record of what happened on Outpost Reach 9 between the 18th day of the 7th cycle and the 53rd day of the 9th, and I am submitting it because someone must, and because I watched all of it from the ridge, and because I am apparently the only Varath official who did. My name is Queth Eris. I have served the Collective's Agricultural Pacification Division for 31 years. I have overseen 11 clearance operations on 6 worlds across 2 treaty sectors. I have a commendation from Director Saul for the Marath Basin relocation in my 31st year, which was completed on time and within operational budget, and did not result in any formal complaints being filed through the Collective's interspecies grievance channel, because the Marath Basin indigenous population was a partially migratory group with no permanent fixed structures, and they left without requiring what our protocol documents call persistent compliance measures. I am telling you this because I want it understood that I am not a person given to unorthodox interpretations. I have spent 31 years interpreting the Agricultural Pacification Division's operational situations in precisely the terms the division provides for that purpose, and I have been good at it. I have never before had occasion to write a report like this one. I am beginning to think that says more about my 11 prior operations than it does about Reach 9. Let me start at the beginning. The colony on Outpost Reach 9 was classified as a Tier 3 encroachment under the Collective's Land Use Harmonization Protocol, Subarticle 19, Clause 4. That classification means unlicensed agricultural settlement on a world whose substrate rights are held by a member entity of the Varath Compact. In this case, Agriclaim Consortium Velectoron, whose extraction license on Reach 9's mineral-rich eastern basin predated the human settlement by 4 years, though only by 4 years, a fact I mention here because it becomes relevant later, and because I find I cannot write this report honestly without mentioning it. The settlement was small, 41 humans by our census, 7 family units, 12 single-occupancy registrations, 2 working partnerships not formalized under any treaty framework we recognized. They had been on Reach 9 for 11 years when the Collective survey team first cataloged them. They had grain silos, 3 of them, corrugated and patched, and clearly the work of people who had been improvising infrastructure for longer than was entirely comfortable. They had irrigation lines tapped off a river the extraction license did not cover. They had a maintenance depot, a school building with 8 children enrolled, a medical station staffed by a single human practitioner, and 4,000 hectares of cultivated land that, by any reasonable measure, someone had worked very hard to build. The survey team's initial report noted that the soil quality in the settlement's primary farming zone was, and I am quoting the document directly, substantially improved over baseline through evident long-term management practice. What this means, in language the Agricultural Pacification Division's documentation is not designed to accommodate, is that 11 years of human hands had turned a mediocre substrate into functional farmland. The survey team filed that observation as a neutral data point. I remember reading it at the time and thinking nothing in particular about it. I mention it now because I have thought about it a great deal since. The collective's legal division spent 14 months determining that none of that was our problem. I say this without particular pride. The legal division is good at what it does. The standard clearance protocol for a Tier 3 encroachment involves two phases: a formal notice period of 90 days, during which the settlement is expected to self-relocate, followed by an enforcement phase if they fail to comply. The humans on Reach 9 received their notice on schedule. They did not self-relocate. They sent a petition to the collective's tribunal requesting a review of the substrate rights claim. The tribunal acknowledged the petition and assigned it a docket number. The petition is still, to my knowledge, pending. The enforcement phase was assigned to my division. I want to be precise about what that means, because precision matters in a report like this one, and because I have found, in the weeks since the events I am about to describe, that I prefer precision to the alternative. The Agricultural Pacification Division does not use weapons. We do not deploy soldiers. We use Korath. If you are not familiar with Korath, you have lived a fortunate life. They are classified as Varath Compact Tier 1 Apex Fauna, which is the highest classification our taxonomy uses, and which means roughly what you would expect. A mature Korath stands 3 meters at the shoulder. They have 6 limbs, 4 locomotive, 2 manipulative, covered in a hide that the collective's materials division has spent 40 years failing to replicate, because it is simultaneously harder than medium-grade armor plating and flexible enough to let the animal move like water. Their neural crests, the raised ridges along the spine and skull, generate a low-frequency pressure field when the animal is in a threat state. You feel it in your back teeth before you hear anything. You feel it in your chest, in the space between your ribs, like something is pressing very gently inward from outside your body. It is not painful. It is persuasive in a way that bypasses the reasoning parts of the brain and goes directly to the part that makes decisions based on survival, which is to say, it is extremely effective. Their bite can shear through the hull plating of a light-class transport. Their manipulative forelimbs can operate pressure hatches. The collective's operational history includes one incident, classified and not widely circulated, in which a Korath that had lost a handler in the field tracked the handler's killers across 3 systems over a period of 14 months before locating them. The operational history does not record what happened when it found them. The security classification does not cover that. I understand the classification was applied because the details were considered potentially destabilizing if widely known. They are also, and I record this detail because it is central to everything that follows, pack animals. Korath do not operate alone. They orient to a pack hierarchy, and within that hierarchy, they orient to what their behavioral science literature calls a pack anchor, the individual at the center of the social structure whose behavioral signals the pack reads and mirrors. In the wild, the pack anchor is the alpha. In a deployed pacification context, the pack anchor is the deployment controller, a trained Varath handler who spends years establishing a bond with a given pack before they are ever fielded operationally. We sent 14 Korath to Reach 9. We did not send a handler. I want to explain that decision, because in retrospect it appears to have been catastrophic, and I feel a professional obligation to note that at the time it appeared entirely reasonable. The Korath on Reach 9 were operating in a low-complexity environment, a flat agricultural settlement, no fortifications, no military presence, 41 unarmed civilians. The protocol for such deployments, under Harmonization Subarticle 19, permits handler-free deployment when the target population is assessed as non-combatant, and the expected operation duration is less than 72 hours. The assessment was accurate on both counts. The protocol said nothing about what happens when the Korath find a pack anchor anyway. The 14 Korath arrived on Reach 9 on day 18 of the 7th cycle at 3:40 local time. I watched from an observation post on the eastern ridge, 7 kilometers from the settlement perimeter. The night was clear. Reach 9 has 2 small moons and they were both up, which gave me reasonable visibility without augmented optics. The pack crossed the perimeter fence in under a minute. 14 animals, moving in a column, silent the way large things are silent when they want to be, not quiet exactly, but present in a way that bypasses the ears and goes straight to some older part of the brain. I had watched Korath deploy twice before from a similar vantage. I knew what came next. I had already filed the preliminary clearance documentation. It was, I will admit, mostly a formality. What came next was not what came next. The pack moved through the first field grain high-stalked mid-season, the kind of growth that takes years of soil management to achieve. They did not damage it. I noticed that first. The alpha moved with the column behind her, threading the rows with more care than I would have credited an animal that size, and the rest followed. I made a note. Behavioral anomaly, I wrote. Pack cohesion intact, no dispersal pattern initiated. They reached the farmstead at 4:12. The farmstead in question belonged to a human named Dale Marsh, whose census file I had reviewed before the operation. He was 61 years old. He had been on Reach 9 for 9 years, having transferred from an earlier settlement on a World 2 systems away that had been decommissioned following a seismic event unrelated to the collective. He had no military record. He had no law enforcement record. He had a record of consistent grain yields, 2 livestock certifications, and a maintenance citation from Reach 9's internal colony board for leaving an irrigation gate open during a frost warning. He was, by any assessment I could make, an entirely ordinary man. He was also awake. I did not expect that. The deployment hour is chosen specifically because it is not the hour when farmers are awake. But his lights were on, not bright, just a low lamp in the front room of the farmhouse. And when the Korath cleared the last of his grain rows and emerged into his yard, the front door opened and he stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing work trousers and a flannel shirt. He had a cup of something hot, steam rose from it in the moonlight. He stood on his porch and looked at the 14 apex predators in his yard and did not move. I braced for the obvious. He took a sip from his cup. I want to be precise about his body language, because I have reviewed my observation logs many times since, and I believe the body language is the whole story in miniature. He did not back toward his door. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak quickly or loudly, or in a way that I would characterize, from 31 years of reading field situation reports, as a fear vocalization. He stood on his porch the way a person stands when they are on their own porch at 4 in the morning because they could not sleep, which is to say completely still and entirely present, as though the porch belonged to them, and therefore everything they could see from it also, in some fundamental sense, belonged to them. And this new situation was simply another feature of their yard requiring their attention. I have interviewed 36 people since returning from Reach 9, as part of the process of composing this report. I asked each of them what they would do if they opened their door in the middle of the night and found 14 Korath in their yard. 35 of them gave me answers involving doors, locks, emergency signals, weapons, or running. One of them was researcher Varath, who said she would like to think she would remain calm, but acknowledged she was probably overestimating herself. Nobody said they would take a sip of their coffee. I watched through my optics for a very long time. Nothing happened. The alpha, a female, 8 years mature, the largest in the pack, stood 20 meters from the porch and looked at the human. The human looked at the alpha. The rest of the pack fanned out slightly behind her, which was not a hunting arrangement. It was something I had never seen Korath do outside of their handler-bonded state. It looked like waiting. Dale Marsh set his cup down on the porch railing. He walked down the 2 steps to the yard. He crouched, not in a defensive posture, just the way someone crouches when they want to look at something at eye level, and he said something. My observation post did not have audio capture at that range. I do not know what he said. I have thought about it many times in the weeks since. I think it was something very ordinary. I think that is precisely the point. The Alpha took 3 steps toward him, stopped, lowered her head. Not a strike posture. I know strike postures. Her neural crests were amber, calm register, the same glow they produce when they are in proximity to a bonded handler. I had never seen that glow on a handler-free animal in the field. I did not know it was possible. She lowered her head until her chin touched the ground. It is a behavior I have since learned, from the collective's Korath Behavioral Archive, is called a recognition display. It means the animal has identified a pack anchor. It is normally only observed in the presence of a trained handler. Dale Marsh put his hand on top of her head. He held it there. His other hand came up and scratched gently along the line of the nearest neural crest. The amber glow intensified. Behind the Alpha, the other 13 Korath sat down. I sat down too, on my observation ridge, because my legs had stopped working correctly. Then I picked up my communicator and began composing the first version of this report. In the days that followed, I made notes. I made a great many notes, because I did not know what else to do, and because writing has always helped me organize the things I cannot explain, and because the things I was watching required considerable organization. Day 19, Dale Marsh fed the Korath. He did not know that they did not eat grain. He apparently assumed they might since he had grain, and the assumption was incorrect. Korath are obligate carnivores and have no particular interest in grain. But he carried a bucket of something out to the yard at dawn and set it down near the Alpha and stood back and watched, and when she showed no interest in it, he took it back inside and came out later with what appeared to be a large portion of dried meat. This she investigated. This the pack investigated. By mid-morning, 5 of the 14 had eaten from his hand. Day 21, the scavengers came. Reach 9 has an endemic pest species, 6-limbed, reptilian, roughly the mass of a large dog, that raids grain stores. The colony has lost significant portions of its harvest to them in prior seasons. 3 of them entered Dale Marsh's storage shed at 5:20. I observed this from the ridge. I also observed what happened next, which was that the nearest Korath, one of the younger males, perhaps 4 years mature, moved from his position on the porch, entered the shed behind the scavengers, and exited 3 minutes later. The scavengers did not exit. The young male lay back down on the porch. Dale Marsh came out at 600 to do his morning rounds, checked the shed, stood in the doorway for a moment, then came back out and patted the young male on the flank as he passed. The young male's neural crests went amber. I recorded this. I did not know what to record it as. Day 24. The pack began accompanying Dale Marsh on his daily inspection of the fields. Not all of them. 4 typically stayed near the farmhouse. The remaining 10 followed him through the rows at a distance of perhaps 3 meters, not clustered, but in a loose formation that tracked his movement. When he stopped to check soil condition or clear a blocked irrigation channel, they stopped. When he moved on, they moved on. He talked to them while he worked. I have since obtained audio capture of some of these conversations, and I want to note for the record that the content was not remarkable. He talked about the grain. He talked about the weather. He told the one he had begun calling Sekal, the Alpha, that her crest was catching the light nicely this morning, and that she looked like she was feeling good today. He talked the way people talk to things they have decided to trust. Sekal walked beside him with her chin at his shoulder height, and her neural crests at a steady amber glow. Day 26. I filed my second extension request. I did not know what else to do. The protocol was clear. If clearance had not been initiated within the observation window, I was to escalate to the enforcement fleet. But there was no precedent in the Agricultural Pacification Division's operational literature for what I was observing, and I was not yet willing to characterize it as a failure of the operation, because I was not yet entirely sure what the operation was doing. I wrote that the behavioral situation required additional monitoring and requested the Threat Assessment Bureau's guidance. They sent me a 2-paragraph acknowledgement and a reminder that Agriclaim Consortium Velectoron had filed a timeline complaint with the collective's dispute board. Day 29. The Marsh family had a dinner. They, and by they, I mean Dale Marsh and apparently 5 of his neighbors, human colonists from adjacent farms whose names I also had in my census files, sat on the porch and ate together as the sun went down, which appeared to be a regular social practice, and the Korath arranged themselves in the yard and on the porch steps as they did so. One of the colonists, a woman named Priya Sohani who ran the nearest adjacent farm, spent some time looking very closely at a young female Korath who had rolled onto her back in the yard, apparently to be scratched. Priya Sohani scratched the animal's underside. The animal's neural crests went amber. Priya Sohani said something to Dale Marsh. He shrugged. She laughed. I did not have audio. I have thought about that conversation also. Day 31. I contacted the Korath Behavioral Archive directly, because I had questions that my division's standard documentation did not answer. The archivist I reached was a researcher named Varath, who has spent 20 years studying Korath pack dynamics in both wild and bonded conditions. I explained what I was observing as accurately as I could. There was a long silence on the line. Then Varath said, "You're describing a wild anchor bond." I said I did not know what that meant. She said it was a theoretical behavior pattern, documented in the earliest Korath research literature, considered by most contemporary researchers to be either mythological or a historical misinterpretation of handler bond formation. The premise was that a Korath pack, absent a trained handler, could under specific circumstances spontaneously transfer anchor recognition to a non-handler individual if certain conditions were met. The conditions she listed were prolonged close proximity, consistent non-threatening behavioral signals, physical contact initiated by the individual, and she paused here, what she described as an appropriate energetic signature. I asked what that meant. She said the original researchers had described it as the quality of stillness in an apex organism. She said she had always assumed that was poetry. Then she said that maybe she should come to Reach 9. I told her the situation was operationally sensitive. She said she was aware of what the Agricultural Pacification Division was, and that she was going to request a research exemption regardless, and that she wished me good luck. I thanked her and closed the connection, and sat on my ridge and watched Dale Marsh walk his fields with 14 apex war beasts, trailing behind him like a flock of very large, very armored, very calm shadows. The 43rd day was when the fleet was authorized. I was not surprised. I had filed my second version of this report 9 days earlier, the 4-page one, and the Threat Assessment Bureau had not responded to it with anything resembling actual thought. They had responded with a directive: Korath reclassification to failed deployment status, operational handoff to Fleet Pacification Command, strike authorization under Harmonization Subarticle 19 enforcement provisions. The directive gave me 48 hours to clear the ridge. I stayed on the ridge. I want to be precise about why. It was not sentiment. I am a professional with 31 years of service, and I do not make operational decisions based on sentiment. I stayed because I had written a report that nobody had read, and I was going to be the person who watched what happened next so that someone, eventually, would have to read it. The strike fleet was small as these things go. 3 vessels, a pair of light enforcement cruisers, and a tender. Their job was to enter atmosphere, deploy suppression teams, and complete the clearance that the Korath had not initiated. It was a routine enforcement action. The fleet had done dozens of them. The human colony on Reach 9 had no shields, no weapons, no military presence of any kind. The expected operation duration was, again, under 72 hours. I note for the record that I had heard that timeline before. I note also, for the record, that I transmitted a full briefing to the fleet commander on the behavioral situation with the Varath before they entered the Reach 9 system. I transmitted it twice. I received one automated acknowledgement, time-stamped during the transit approach, which told me the message had been logged in the mission file. I do not know if anyone read it. The fleet dropped out of transit into Reach 9 high orbit on the 43rd day, at 1100 local time. I observed their approach on my ridge sensors. Clear day, the same clear, wide sky that had sat over the settlement for the entire 9 weeks I had been here, the kind of open sky that made you understand why someone might decide to farm a world. Warm, light wind coming off the valley. The grain in the fields was high now, mid-season, and it moved in that wind the way grain does when it is healthy, in long, slow waves, the whole field breathing. I had watched it come up from early growth over 9 weeks, and I want to note that watching grain grow is not something I had ever previously considered a notable experience. But the fields of Reach 9 had a quality I did not have precise vocabulary for, something about the fact that all of it was here because someone had decided it should be, and had shown up every morning to make it so. The transit flash lit the sky at 1109 seconds. Dale Marsh was working his western field when it hit. He stopped, shaded his eyes and looked up, not startled exactly, more the way a person looks up when they hear a sound they were not expecting, assessing it, filing it. Then he looked at Sekel, who was standing 3 meters off his left shoulder the way she always did when he was in the field. Sekel was already looking up. Her neural crests were red. I had not seen them red before. In 9 weeks of continuous observation, I had never seen the crests on any of the 14 Varath shift to red. It was a color I knew from the collective's operational documentation, from the caution markings on the deployment containers, from the thick paragraphs in the protocol manual that used words like maximum threat response and handler-directed only and uncontrolled clearance event. Red was the state the Varath were supposed to be in when they arrived at Reach 9 weeks ago. It was the state they were supposed to have stayed in until the clearance was complete. Instead, they had spent 9 weeks going amber. And now, all at once, all 14 of them, their crests went red together. The pressure field hit me from 7 kilometers away. I felt it in my back teeth and in my chest and in the space behind my eyes. I have been in the field during Varath deployments twice before, and I have never felt the pressure field at that range. The animals were in synchronized maximum threat response, and the field was broadcasting across the whole valley, and even from the ridge it felt like someone had quietly pressed a hand against my sternum and was pushing, steadily, with exactly enough force to make me very aware of where I was standing. Dale Marsh stood in his field and felt all of that and looked at Sekel's crests. He looked back at the sky. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, not a restraining gesture, not a command, just the way you put your hand on someone's shoulder when you wanted them to know you were there, and said something that my audio capture did get, because I had upgraded my systems on the 40th day and was running full-spectrum observation by then. He said, "Easy, girl." That was all. Sekel's crests went amber. And then, in less than 30 seconds, every crest in the pack went amber too. I have thought about that moment more than any other in the 9 weeks I spent on that ridge. The Alpha had been in a maximum threat response state. Her pack had mirrored it because that is what packs do. And then a 61-year-old grain farmer said 2 words and touched her shoulder, and the whole architecture of the pack's threat state collapsed, because he was their anchor and the anchor was calm. And when the anchor is calm, the pack is calm. What happened next was not calm. It was simply not the kind of not calm I had been expecting. The fleet entered atmosphere on a standard suppression approach, 2 cruisers in a forward sweep, the tender holding high orbit. The suppression teams would have been staging in the bay, running through their gear checks, thinking about a routine clearance on a quiet farming world. The sensors on those cruisers were good hardware, good enough to detect the 14 life sign signatures in and around the settlement perimeter, good enough to identify them as Korath. I know this because the fleet commander sent an emergency transmission at 11:34, 9 minutes after atmospheric entry, requesting clarification of the pack behavioral status. I transmitted my full briefing again. I received no further communication from the fleet. What I observed from the ridge was this. The Korath did not move to attack, they moved to stand. 14 animals, in a loose dispersal pattern across the western and northern approaches to the settlement, the directions from which a suppression team would enter if they came down on foot, and the directions from which a cruiser would make its closest pass if the commanders decided to abort the ground operation and use air suppression instead. They stood. They were visible, deliberately visible, I think, though I acknowledge I am applying intent to animal behavior, and the behavioral science literature would caution me against that. They stood in the open, in the clear afternoon light, with their neural crests burning red in a frequency that my ridge sensors were reading as high-intensity broadcast, a pressure field that would be perceptible to any ship instrumentation sensitive enough to detect biological signatures. They were not hiding. They were not posturing. They were simply there, and they were large, and there were 14 of them, and they were looking at the sky with the focused patience of animals that have done difficult things before and are not troubled by the prospect of doing them again. I have reviewed the fleet's sensor logs, which were included in the mission file that was eventually made available to my division as part of the operational review. The sensors identified the Korath signatures at 11:42. At 11:44, the fleet commander queried tactical analysis for a threat assessment. Tactical analysis returned a report at 11:47. I have read that report. Its final line reads, "No recommended engagement profile. Recommend continued altitude hold pending behavioral resolution." The fleet held altitude for 47 minutes. I timed it. 47 minutes of 2 light enforcement cruisers orbiting at 3,000 meters altitude above a farming settlement on a treaty world, while 14 Korath stood in their approach corridors with their neural crests on fire. 47 minutes of tactical analysis that could not find a recommended engagement profile for 14 bonded apex war beasts positioned between a strike fleet and a single farming settlement, waiting, with the particular quality of waiting that meant they had nowhere else to be. The settlement's communication system had broadcast an alert when the fleet entered orbit. I know this because I was monitoring all frequencies. The colonists received the alert. Several of them gathered in the settlement's central square. Some had their emergency kits. One of them, I noted from my ridge position, was standing on a grain silo watching the sky through a long-range viewer. Children had been brought into the school building. Dale Marsh had gone back to work. I do not know if this was stubbornness or practicality or a quality I do not yet have a precise name for. I know what my observation logs show, which is that while the fleet held at 3,000 meters and the colonists gathered in their square and the Korath stood in their formation with their crests burning, Dale Marsh moved through the last rows of his western field and checked his plants with his fingertips and did his work. Sekel walked with him. Her crests were amber. At 12:21, the fleet began withdrawing to high orbit. At 12:49, they initiated transit departure. At 12:53, Dale Marsh came out of his farmhouse with a cup of something hot, sat down on his porch steps, and watched the last of the transit flashes fade against the afternoon sky. He sat there for a while. Sekel came and lay down beside him, her great black-armored body stretched along the length of the porch, her chin on his knee. The other Korath settled around the yard by degrees, and he put his hand on Sekel's flank and they watched the sky together until it was nothing but sky again. Then he got up and went back to work. I remained on the ridge for another 7 days. I told myself it was to complete my observational record. In honesty, I needed the time to understand what I had seen, or at least to make enough peace with not understanding it to write this report without sounding like a person who had lost their professional bearings. I am not sure I have entirely succeeded, but I am trying. Let me try to say plainly what happened on Reach 9 in the 53 days I observed it. The Varath collective sent 14 apex war beasts to clear a human farming colony. The war beasts arrived, encountered a 61-year-old farmer in the early hours of the morning, and within a span of hours began displaying bonded handler behavioral signatures. By the end of the first week, they were accompanying him through his fields. By the end of the second week, they were defending his grain stores. By the end of the third week, they were a functional member of his farm operation. When a collective strike fleet arrived to complete the clearance the Korath had not initiated, the pack positioned themselves between the fleet and the settlement and held that position until the fleet withdrew. The fleet withdrew. I want to be careful about how I characterize what Dale Marsh did. He did not train these animals. He did not fight them. He did not, as far as I could observe, do anything that any sentient creature with basic awareness of its environment and a reasonable degree of calm would not have done when faced with 14 large animals in his yard in the middle of the night. He crouched down. He spoke to them. He offered them water and eventually meat. He scratched their crests. He talked to them about his grain and his weather and how they looked like they were feeling today. He went to work in his fields and they followed him and he let them. When something threatened his stores, they dealt with it and he said thank you by touching them and they went amber. He never once appeared afraid. Not on the night they arrived. Not when they followed him into his fields. Not when he watched the fleet approach and turned and looked at Sekel and put his hand on her and said, "Easy, girl." That is not something I know how to explain in the terms my division uses. I have reviewed the protocol language for Tier 3 clearance operations, the Korath deployment guidelines, the behavioral science literature, and the 3 prior field reports I could find from operations where Korath exhibited anomalous bonding behaviors. None of them have language for this. They use phrases like unexpected anchor transfer and deployment failure, behavioral and non-combatant override, and those phrases are accurate as far as they go. They just do not go very far. Researcher Varath, who did eventually come to Reach 9, she arrived on day 48, 6 days after the fleet withdrew, with a research kit and 2 graduate students, and an expression that I can only describe as barely contained professional excitement, told me that she had a theory. She said that the Korath, as a species that had evolved over millions of years to orient their deepest behavioral architecture around a pack anchor, were exquisitely sensitive to what she called the apex signature, the specific quality of presence that an organism at the top of its local food chain radiates. She said that in a handler-free environment, the pack would be actively seeking an anchor, and that their sensitivity to the apex signature would be at its highest. She said that a human who moved without fear, who acted with calm confidence in their own competence and their own right to occupy their environment, who made physical contact without aggression and spoke without threat, would have produced exactly the signal the pack was tuned to receive. I asked her whether any individual with that quality of presence would have achieved the same result, or whether there was something particular about this individual. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "The signature isn't a performance. You can't fake it. What the pack is reading is a lifetime of behavioral patterns. The way you move in a space you've made yours over years. The way you make decisions that assume your own right to be where you are without having to reassert it. An animal can tell the difference between someone who learned to walk confidently last week and someone who has been walking confidently in that specific space for 9 years. One reads as apex. The other reads as a very well-practiced approximation of apex." She paused. "Korath don't bond to approximations." She said, "The fascinating thing about this species is that they don't distinguish between apex predators and apex farmers. What they're reading isn't threat capacity, it's certainty. Your man out there has been working this land for 9 years. He is completely certain that he belongs here. That's what they felt. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about Dale Marsh at 41 years old, moving his family's entire life from a failed settlement to an unsettled rock 2 systems away, and spending 9 years building something in the soil of a world that had given him nothing to start with. I thought about what it feels like to be certain that you belong somewhere. I thought about how that certainty must carry, in the body, in the voice, in the way a person moves through their own fields at 4 in the morning, and stands on their porch with a cup of something hot, and looks at 14 apex war beasts, and decides the right response is to crouch down and talk to them. I thought about the fleet, about the 47 minutes they held altitude and could not convince themselves to descend. I have worked in the Agricultural Pacification Division for 31 years. I have overseen clearance operations on 6 worlds. In all that time, I do not think I have ever considered whether the people we were clearing had, in any meaningful sense, earned the right to be on the land we were clearing them from. I do not think my division considers that question a relevant variable. The relevant variables are the substrate rights assessment, the compliance timeline, the escalation authorization, and the operation duration. None of those variables include what happens when the people you are clearing have spent 9 years becoming so completely, so quietly, and so irreversibly themselves that the most dangerous animals in the collective's arsenal look at them and think, "That is my pack anchor, and I am staying." I submitted my 3rd report, this one, to Director Orvith Saul, with copies to the Threat Assessment Bureau, the Korath Behavioral Science Archive, and the collective's legal division, which I understand is still processing the Reach 9 settlement's docket petition. I do not know what the collective will do next. That is not within my remit to determine. What I can tell you is what exists on Reach 9 as of the final day of my observation, and I will be as precise as I know how to be. There are 41 humans on Reach 9. They have 4,000 hectares of cultivated grain, 2 livestock operations, a school, a medical station, and a maintenance depot. Their western and northern fields now bear additional trampled paths that were not on the earlier survey maps, which are Korath walking routes. Their grain silos have recorded a 0% pest loss rate for the last 26 days, which is a colony record. Dale Marsh's porch has been enlarged, at some point in the last 3 weeks, because the original porch was not quite wide enough to accommodate both the usual evening gatherings and Sekal lying on her side across the boards. There are 14 Korath on Reach 9. They are in bonded behavioral state. They are not bonded to the collective's deployment authorization. They are not bonded to my division's operational parameters. They are not bonded to any variable that the collective's protocol documents mention or anticipate. They are bonded to a 61-year-old grain farmer who crouched down in his yard in the middle of the night and talked to them like they were something worth talking to. I have been trying to think of something to add beyond that, because a report that ends there does not feel like a complete report, but I find that it is what happened. A man stood on his porch in the dark and looked at the things his world had sent to remove him from it, and he was not afraid, and they sat down. The fleet came back. I should have mentioned that earlier. On day 49, 6 days after the first withdrawal, the same 3-vessel configuration dropped back into Reach 9 orbit. I was still on my ridge. Researcher Varath was 3 kilometers away in the settlement, running behavioral surveys, and I sent her a notification, and she sent me back a message that said only, "I know, I'm watching." The fleet held high orbit for 6 hours. The Korath positioned themselves identically to the first time. Same dispersal, same approach corridors, crests red patient. Dale Marsh had been notified by his colony's communication system that vessels were in orbit. He came out onto his new wider porch, stood with his coffee and looked at the sky. Sekal stood beside him. After a while, he said something and went back inside. The fleet initiated transit departure at 1808. They did not come back a third time. I confirmed this through the collective's fleet tracking system before I left the ridge. The vessels were reassigned to an operation in the Keleth border sector. The Reach 9 mission file was closed with a status notation that I found, upon review, to be genuinely remarkable in its bureaucratic creativity. The operation was listed as completed under the heading, Environmental Obstacles Precluding Clearance, which is typically used for geological events, severe weather, and radiation hazards. I suppose, in a technical sense, that is not entirely wrong. There is a final thing I want to record, because I think it belongs in this report, even if I cannot entirely account for why. On my last morning on the ridge, I broke protocol. I had been observing from 7 kilometers for 53 days, and on my last morning, I walked down into the settlement. I told myself I needed to update my survey maps with the new Korath Trail paths. This was true. It was also not the reason. Dale Marsh was in his western field when I arrived. It was early, the light was still low and golden, and the dew was on the grain, and the whole field had the quality of something held carefully. He was moving along a row, checking the stalks, touching them with his fingertips in the way that people who have grown things long enough do automatically, reading the plant the way other people read a document. He had a hand tool hanging from his belt, and a hat that had seen too many seasons and boots that were the same. 6 Korath were spaced through the rows around him, following his progress with the patience of animals that have nothing more urgent to do than be where their anchor is. He heard me coming and looked up. He did not look alarmed. He looked, if I had to put a word on it, like a man who had been told for 9 years that a Varath official might eventually show up on his farm and had simply not let that possibility interrupt his morning. He said, "Surveyor." I said I was from the collective's Agricultural Pacification Division. I said I had been the observing officer for the recent operation. I said I had come to update my survey documentation. He said, "All right," and went back to checking his grain. I stood in his field for a moment. Sekel was 10 meters away, lying in the row with her head raised, watching me. Her crests were amber. She was very large. I am not, despite 31 years in the Agricultural Pacification Division, a person who has spent significant time in physical proximity to a Korath without barriers between us. I updated my survey maps. When I was ready to go, I said to Dale Marsh, "The fleet has been reassigned. They won't be coming back." He looked up from his grain again, considered me for a moment, then he said, "I figured." I said, "The colony's docket petition is still pending. I can't make any representations about how the collective will proceed." He said, "I know." There was a pause. I was not sure what else to say. I am not, by nature, a person who finds silence particularly difficult, but this was a specific kind of silence, the kind that has something in it that the words haven't quite reached yet. I said, "You weren't afraid, that first night." He looked at me steadily. He had the kind of face that comes from a long time outdoors, weathered in the way that things are weathered when they have been present through a lot of weather rather than being damaged by it. He said, "They came into my yard. Wasn't going to help being afraid. Most people would have been." He shrugged. "Most people weren't here." He went back to his grain. Sekel turned her head and watched me walk away, with that amber light running steady along her crests, calm and complete, and I walked back up to my ridge and broke down my observation post and filed my last survey entry and left Reach 9. I have been trying, in the weeks since, to write a clear-eyed conclusion to this report, something the collective can act on, something the Threat Assessment Bureau can put in a file and reference in future protocol amendments, something useful. What I keep arriving at is this. Dale Marsh did not call for help. He did not know to call for help. He did not know the collective was coming, or what it had sent, or that there was anything to call about. He stood on his porch in the dark and he looked at what was in his yard, and he responded to it in the only way that apparently made sense to him, which was calmly and directly and without fear, because those were the only tools he had, and he had been using them long enough that they were simply how he operated. And that was enough. I think about the fleet, holding at 3,000 meters for 47 minutes. I think they were probably waiting for the Korath to move, to disperse, or to display aggression, or to do anything that fit the categories that a strike fleet's threat assessment system knows how to process. I think the thing they could not process was 14 apex war beasts standing still and patient in the open country of a farming world, in the afternoon light, crests burning red, while behind them in the settlement a man was in his fields doing his work. The fleet had suppression teams. It had air coverage. It had, on paper, everything it needed to complete a Tier 3 clearance operation on a non-military agricultural settlement. What it did not have was a reason to believe that what was standing in front of it was not the most dangerous thing on Reach 9. It was not. The most dangerous thing on Reach 9 was the same thing it had been for 9 years. The fact of the settlement itself, the cumulative weight of 4,000 hectares of cultivation and 11 years of presence, and 41 people who had come to a rock with nothing, and made it into somewhere they belonged so completely, and so finally that even the apex weapons sent to dislodge them decided to stay. I am submitting this report. I am not making a recommendation. I have made recommendations in this matter twice, and they were not read, and I find I am no longer certain what I would recommend even if I believed it would be received differently. I will say only what I observed. I observed a man stand on his porch in the dark and look at 14 war beasts and not run. I observed the war beasts sit down. I observed a fleet hold at 3,000 meters and turn around twice. I observed the same man, 53 days later, check his grain in the morning light with the same 6 Korath in his rows, unhurried, certain, present, as though none of what had happened between those 2 mornings had fundamentally altered the nature of his day, which I think it had not. He had always been there. He had always been staying. We just hadn't understood yet what that meant. I have signed this report. I have dated it. I have filed it through the standard channels. I have also sent a personal copy to researcher Varath, because she asked for it, and because I think she is the only person involved in this matter who will read it and understand what it is actually about. The colony on Outpost Reach 9 is still there. Dale Marsh is still farming. The Korath are still in his fields. The petition is still pending. I expect it will be pending for some time.